Hello, everyone. Oh, let's stop the music. With me all right. Hello, everyone, and welcome to today's webinar, which will be focused on web accessibility and the legal risks that are happening in the US, particularly in New York. And while I share my screen, here we go. So my name is Sapir Yarden. I am part of accessiBe's marketing department. Yesterday was my 4-year anniversary, so hopefully I have enough knowledge to share today with you and also answer some of your questions. And I'm really excited to jump into this topic because it is a really timely and important one. We're going to talk about the ADA and web accessibility compliance. And I am joined by my good friend, Kelley, who I am very excited to have here with you. And Kelley, would you like to introduce yourself briefly?
Yes, good afternoon, everyone. My name is Kelley Simoneaux. I'm a lawyer who's based in DC. And when I was 16, I was in a car wreck and became a paraplegic, paralyzed and using a wheelchair. And in that moment, I realized how important it was to navigate life from a different lens. And so since that time, I put a lot of emphasis in my advocacy and my practice of law and looking at accessibility. And I'm really glad to be with you all here today to talk about such an important aspect of accessibility, which is the digital landscape and what we can do to create more accessibility while also reducing legal risk.
Thanks for sharing that. I'll also give you credit for something that happened just this past week, I think, where you were voted in the top DC lawyers.
Yeah, it's always good when you're working hard to get those recognitions, and I'm glad to be able to continue to work for the disability community.
Fantastic. And we're so excited to have you here with us today and to share your knowledge as well. So I'm going to briefly cover the agenda and what we're going to discuss in today's webinar. First, a broad overview of web accessibility, what that is, if this is your first time learning about it. Then we'll also dive into the American with Disabilities Act and the official guidelines for web accessibility, the Web Content Accessibility Guidelines, also known as WCAG or WCAG. And then we'll cover the cost of litigation, the costs that you probably don't want to be paying. And the landscape of New York lawsuits over the past year, we even have some insight into what's happening this year. Finally, we'll cover the benefits of an accessible website, because with everything that has a risk, we also want to look at the upside and to tell you all of the wonderful things that your business can do by having an accessible website. And time permitting, we'll jump into a demo of the Access widget solution, which is one of our many solutions for web accessibility. So I think we're ready. To briefly cover what web accessibility is, it's basically the practice of ensuring that people with disabilities can effectively perceive, navigate, interact with, and contribute to content on your website. In the same way that your storefront probably doesn't want to prohibit anyone from entering, neither does your website. And that's usually your first sort of digital business card or digital footprint into what your business is offering. So we want to make sure that your websites are reachable, accessible, and helpful for everyone who wants to consume the information you're sharing, the products that you're selling, and the services that you might have for them. So when we're talking about being accessible, we're talking about the disability community in particular, but also the wider community. When we're making something accessible, it usually also is accessible for many more people. If we think about curb cuts, for example, those were generally thought of to be helpful for wheelchair users, but today they also benefit people who have strollers, luggage, bicycles. There are many, many uses. And so when we think about accessibility, try to open your mind also to the idea that a website being usable and accessible for people with disabilities might also mean that it's usable for a much wider audience. And so that community, based on research from the Valuable 500, was estimated to have about an $8 trillion spending power. So not a small community. The disability community is probably, or I believe, according to the CDC, is currently 27% of the population, which means that this is the largest minority group across the US. So when we're thinking about the $8 trillion, that's a massive spending power. But when we think about the broader community that this impacts, we're also thinking about the $13 trillion of the community members related to the disability community. That's friends, family, the people that they're sharing with. Because the disability community is very loyal. When they find a website that works particularly well for them, they're going to come back to it again and again. They're going to share that website or that business with their community. And that's how we're basically going to be able to drive more awareness to your brand. So this is also a statement of diversity and inclusion. It's also about adhering to the guidelines, which Kelley will talk about in a moment, and complying with the different laws and regulations. There's the federal law, which is the American with Disabilities Act, as well as other state and local regulations, which we'll get into. So, Kelley, I'm going to hand it off to you now to cover all of that.
Great. So yeah, it's really important to understand kind of like, oftentimes why we do things. Of course, at a very basic level, we're looking at web accessibility because it makes good business sense and it's really the right thing to do. But we also have some guidance within our laws and regulations that really make it clear that we're required to have our websites accessible. So, kind of let's start at really the foundational piece of legislation that was really a monumental and changing piece of legislation in terms of accessibility. Back in 1990, the Americans with Disabilities Act was signed into law, and that was to ensure that people with disabilities have the same rights as everyone else. Back in 1990, I will say, and we can all recognize that our digital footprint looked very different than it did today. Certainly, the World Wide Web, the way that we function, was operating in significantly different terms 35 years ago. And for that reason, unfortunately, it was not specifically contemplated, like, what does web accessibility look like? So often the question I get is like, okay, but like, does the ADA apply to websites? And the simple answer to that is yes. Back in 2022, after there was a lot of back and forth and questions of how does the ADA really apply to web accessibility, the Department of Justice sent out a letter to confirm that yes, the ADA requirements apply to all goods, services, privileges, activities, and offered by public accommodations, and that does include a website. So just as your brick and mortar should have an accessible entrance to get into, so should your website. It should have that accessible entrance so that people with different disabilities can also have the same opportunity to view a website as someone who does not need accessibility features. And really what we're thinking about when we know what we've got received the guidance by the Department of Justice related to the Americans with Disabilities Act, and what we know will eventually happen is there's going to be further legislation that really defines web accessibility. We know that because we've already seen that. We've seen back in 2022 the Website and Software Applications Accessibility Act was introduced to both the House of Representatives as well as the U.S. Senate, and that was to, in very simple terms, affirm that the ADA prohibits discrimination against individuals with disabilities when using websites, software applications, and other digital technologies. So while that particular piece of legislation was not fully passed and in effect right now, what we anticipate and what we will continue to update on is what that legislation is going to ultimately look like. But still, the basis is it's going to confirm what we know now, which is that the ADA does require web accessibility. And so the ADA is the piece of legislation that says this is what that a person with a disability should have that access. But then the question is, well, what does that access look like? And that's where the WCAG, the Web Content Accessibility Guidelines, the WCAG, comes into place. And it's actually internationally recognized, not just in the US, but the WCAG standard, someone from another country could come onto a website that was made in the US, and those standards, those guidelines would still be at that acceptable level. So because it's been cited in courts and it's cited in legislation that the WCAG is that guiding standard on what web accessibility actually functionally looks like. It was developed by the W3C to define best practices and the designs for web accessibility. And what does that mean? Well, it means like what are the standards in order for a screen reader to be able to present itself onto a website. It requires certain keyboard navigation, so someone can use their keyboard in order to navigate around a website. It also is looking at different things such as making sure the website seizure safe, the UI and design, and making sure that the content is digestible for people at all different levels of comprehension.
Kelley, thank you for sharing that, because a lot of times when people think about the web content accessibility guidelines or what it means to make a website accessible, it can be quite overwhelming. I mean, the WCAG is basically like a 1,000-page guidebook, and it can be a bit dense to review every single element and to know what standards you need to uphold and how in depth you need to go on every single thing. But there are different levels to the WCAG. There's the level A, which is the basic, the double A, which is what courts want us to aspire to, or the standard that we're expected to meet. And then there's a triple A requirements, which are basically like a going above and beyond the compliance expectations. But if you think about it from a usability perspective, making sure that assistive technologies can navigate the website, so whether that's a screen reader, just using a keyboard, or any other type of tech that will help you navigate the website, and it doesn't break the website, it can continue to work in the same way as it does for anyone else. That is what we're hoping to get at.
Right. So we've kind of talked about the foundation of why we need to have websites accessible and what in terms of like how that needs to present itself. But now it's turning to like, well, if I wait, if I delay, if I just don't have these features and I'm not at at the WCAG AA standard, like what happens then? And so now we're going to turn to really what that legal risk looks like. I will tell you, as a member of the disability community and someone who works in this space, is that people are starting to care more and more about their ability to be able to have access on the web. It is so important in all of our lives. And how does that translate? Well, sometimes to make those changes, people initiate lawsuits. And what we are seeing year over year, and there is a chart depicted on our slide that very clearly illustrates there are more lawsuits being filed every year related to web accessibility. In 2023, that broke the record for lawsuits, ADA lawsuits and demands, jumping up from 2022. And I can tell you 2024 was a jump from 23. And we anticipate 25 to be a jump from 24. What that means is every year there are more of these cases being filed, and actually with success. If a website is not accessible, there are significant legal risks. And sometimes when we think about the legal landscape, we're thinking like, well, what's been filed in court? But I want to make clear that the risk starts before there's a lawsuit. Um, Oftentimes, these risks start by would receive a demand letter where someone is saying, "Hey, your site's not accessible. Here's our demand for you to change that, and here is the cost that it's going to be because now we've had to get lawyers involved, and that's never inexpensive." And so, more than 8,000 businesses received a demand letter each month, and we anticipate that number to be growing a lot as well. And I think that the illustration here is always a really good one. What we see versus what the totality of it is, where what we see below, what we can't see below the surface. So if we're looking at, there were 4,605 web accessibility lawsuits that were filed. That's what we can see. Those have been filed in court, and that's public, by the way. It's another reason why you don't want to get to that place. Your name is publicly out there as not being having an accessible website. But the reality is there's many, many more cases, demand letters going on that our eyes do not see because the reality is like 97% of the cases are settled before going to trial. So this is a very large problem, and we want to avoid that because there are so many great ways and solutions on making websites accessible now that you don't have to fall in the category of this substantial risk.
This is actually, you're reminding me of a conversation that I had with a friend. So in fact, when I started at accessiBe, which was about, we said 4 years ago, the percent of websites that were accessible was around 3. And we've gone up to about 5% of websites are accessible now. And part of the reality is websites are being built every single day, but there's not enough awareness of how to build an accessible website, what to do, what solutions can help. But when I just joined the company, I remember having a conversation with a friend who works for a very big corporate, and they told me that they get one of these lawsuits every single quarter, and they choose to settle every single time. And I said, well, wouldn't it just be more, affordable and better for your reputation if you actually took care of accessibility from the beginning? So that point sort of resonates with me when I see that 97% of cases are settled before they even go to trial.
Right. Yeah.
Oh, I jumped over one. There we go.
Yeah, and I mean, if I'm a small business owner myself, so sometimes we look in things of like, what's our financial risk here? Because a legal risk translates to some financial, that's going to cost you. So the bottom line is businesses are paying a major price for not looking at accessibility on the front end and retroactively, because at the end of the day, you're going to have to fix it if this comes up. And the average cost, if you have a demand letter that's sent saying that you're in violation of the ADA because you're not having accessibility standards met on your website, you're talking about attorney's fees on both sides. I mean, that could be 5 to 15,000 for the person bringing it, and you having to recuperate those costs to them. $5,000 for your own lawyer. And then ultimately, again, we're talking about the remediation costs, the audits, and that can be 5 to upwards of, $20,000, $40,000 for not being proactive and getting ahead of the web accessibility curve. That's a big cost, and that's a risk you don't want to take. So today we are talking to people who are in New York, and there's a reason. That reason is because the data shows that the number of lawsuits being filed, the number one state jurisdiction that they're being filed in is New York. If you look at the chart that's depicted on our screen, you can see it's not even close. California has quite a few, has, had over 200 lawsuits filed in 2024. Florida is in there, but we're talking, well over 700, cases filed in 2024 alone in New York. And so that and I want to be clear, you don't, when it comes to operating a website online, you don't have to be located in New York to feel the impact. As long as you're putting yourself out there to New York consumers, if you're selling something in New York, your case can be filed in New York, and the data showing it oftentimes is. And so there are a lot of lawsuits being filed in New York on web accessibility issues, and we believe that that number is only going to continue to rise.
We've been doing a lot of activities locally in New York to raise awareness among our web agency partners around small businesses and other local businesses in New York. But like you said, the risk exists for anyone who has a website. That's part of having a public accommodation, is that it's for the public. And what's interesting is that we're seeing new regulations come up globally as well. Europe, the EU has released their regulation for the European Accessibility Act in June. And also, if you're a US business but selling to Europe, you need to be accessible. So it goes globally, and that's something that businesses should be aware of.
Very true. And then we're really gonna dive into get into really who, if you're a business owner, if you're operating, you're selling to people in New York, but let's look at the realities of the types of businesses that have a higher risk, because there is data that shows that there are types of businesses that do, and the e-commerce businesses face more accessibility related lawsuits than any other industry. Over 75% of those cases are related to e-com businesses. And that kind of makes sense, because that's, if you're trying to go on and I want to buy a blouse, but I require a screen reader and I can't get on to purchase that blouse, then, that's where people are like, hey, I just wanted to buy this shirt. So the e-com businesses are really the ones that have a higher risk, because that's where the consumers, the people with disabilities, they're just trying to get on there and order something like everyone else, and if they can't, then it's going to be a problem. So 75% are the e-com businesses.
That goes back to the point about brand loyalty. When a website works, you're going to keep coming back to it. And if it doesn't work for you, you're probably not going to visit that business again.
Oh, so true. Like, as a wheelchair user, there's a coffee shop I can easily get in and out of. It has good parking. It has, accessible entrance. That's where I'm getting my coffee from, because it's been made easy for me.
Makes sense.
Mm-hmm.
So this is a good time for us to pause and ask, do you know if your website is accessible and compliant? So we actually have a solution. You can use your phone now to scan with the QR code that's on the screen, or visit accessibe.com/accessscan. And here you'll find an web page where you can add your website's domain, and it will scan, our AI will scan the website and review it according to the WCAG guidelines, and identify where you are accessible, where you're performing well, but also where the gaps are, and which community is most affected by that. And I think that's a really cool thing for you to be able to visualize as well, well is it's not only, hey, you're not doing this well, but this is the exact group that it's affecting and how it's affecting them, so that you can then go ahead, prioritize the changes that you're going to make to your website and make sure that you're going to be accessible. And as we're getting into the holiday season, and holiday season in New York is something that I love, making sure that your website is accessible ahead of that so you can maximize on the number of customers that you're serving, on the number of sales that you're having. That is also really great and important information. So in essence, what we really wanted to cover today is how to grow your website with an accessible, how to grow your business with an accessible website. So there are many benefits that we have sort of touched on today, and I'll go into a little bit more detail on them now. Initially, an accessible website that has the proper markups and information on the code level is going to perform better from an SEO perspective, and also increase organic traffic. There have been several studies that have been conducted around this, and we can share them with you after the recording. As we're getting into the age of AI, we're also seeing that having accessible documentation on your website will help your website perform better in the long term and have more discoverability. Secondly, before we get into the New Year's tax season, businesses that make their website accessible may be eligible for a tax credit of up to $5,000. We have a lot of content about this on our website. It depends on the size of your business and the revenue, but of course, this is something that is available to many, many small businesses, and we encourage you to look into it, as it is another benefit that can give you a return on your accessibility efforts. We talked a couple of times about customer loyalty and reducing churn. So that means making sure that you're tapping into those customers who do want to purchase from you, and that they can keep coming back to your business. Because when you delight them with an accessible and usable experience, they're going to want to return. And lastly, it also means reaching new audiences. So if you're able to extend your website to more users, and as we said, the largest minority group in the US, then that also means that you're going to be able to drive more sales. So what are brands missing out on by not having an accessible website? So the churn for shoppers with disabilities who have left a website, basically this could be like cart abandonment or having an inaccessible experience, is around 28%. So that's higher than a quarter of your website visitors are leaving because they're having an inaccessible experience. The traffic of websites that had an increase after implementing an accessibility solution is, on the contrary, 73%, above 73%. And with customer loyalty, we know that customers are saying that the majority of them are saying that social values are helping shape their shopping choices. And we're seeing this more and more also with younger generations. There's a lot of data coming out around Gen Z and millennial purchasing habits and how that's affecting customer loyalty and what brands are shopping with. And making your website accessible is, in a way, making a statement also about what your brand stands for, which is making sure that everyone can shop at your business, or reach your business, learn from your business, leverage the information on it. So businesses that are not accessible actually stand to lose about $6.9 billion per year, because people with disabilities might choose to buy elsewhere. And I know that that's a reality with the checkout flows, with product descriptions not being accessible, maybe the content's not super readable, or the fonts aren't accessible. All of those things could impact your website and are things to be conscientious of when you're building your website, reviewing your website, and optimizing it for every single user. So we definitely encourage you to start your accessibility and compliance journey. The benefits and the risks were outlaid in this conversation today. And so one of the easiest ways to get started, or I guess the simplest way to get started, is to trial and start an installation of Access Widget. So I mentioned that's our AI-powered solution. It works with any CMS or website builder that's built on JavaScript. We have installation guides that are on our website, so you can go ahead and check those out and easily customize the widget, which is the button that appears on your website, to the specific branding and UI that you have on your website. So you don't need to go ahead with the default options. If you have a website that you worked hard on to customize and make sure that it's the branding that you want to convey, we can match our, we can configure the widget to your branding. Once it's installed, Access Widgets AI will scan and analyze all of the code elements on the website and start issuing remediations to make sure that they are accessible within the next 48 hours. After that, it starts doing a daily scan of your website to ensure that any changes that you're making, if you're updating new products, if you're making any changes, if you have promotions, new blogs, any of that content will all be accessible through the remediations that are happening. Additionally, you will get from accessiBe an accessibility statement that covers the ways that Access Widget works, from all of the UI adjustments that happen all the way to the back end technology, which is keyboard navigation and the screen reader optimization. So this will help you showcase your compliance efforts. And we always encourage businesses to add that to their websites as well, because it's another way of showing that you're taking care of this, that you have a way to contact you and to be in touch if you have an accessible, if a customer needs more accessibility, so that you can be ahead of it. And that's another way for you to ensure that you have ongoing accessibility with the daily automated scans, but also you'll receive a monthly report from us that tells you all of the changes that have been made to your website. So you always are in the know, and you can always reach out to us, and we're happy via chat, via your account manager, your customer success rep, to be in touch about how your accessibility efforts are going and what you can do to continue to optimize on your accessibility and compliance journey. So I think we have a few minutes to do a demo, if that's okay with everyone. I'll briefly share my screen. Here we go. And share. Okay. Kelley, can you see my screen? Perfect. So this was built as your typical e-commerce furniture site, I guess. We do have the Access widget in the bottom left corner here of the website. I'm just going to squeeze right there and click on it. Once I open it, that accessibility statement that I mentioned is right there front and center. So it tells you all of the ways that your website is accessible according to the W3C, so the World Wide Web Consortium's guidelines of WCAG 2.1 at the AA level. You will receive this as a document that you can also add to your website. We have specific profiles here that a user can customize. So for example, if I scroll down below, I should see a video. So if I actually click on the seizure safe profile, it will stop any motion and affect the colors so that it's a much safer viewing experience for someone who is prone to seizures, if they're epileptic or have another condition. Additionally, we have the vision impaired profile or the low vision profile. This is going to enhance the font and colors on the screen to make sure that it's a much more accessible viewing experience for those with degrading eyesight. My personal favorite is our ADHD friendly profile. Oh, sorry. My computer is unhappy with me at this time. Here we go. So the ADHD friendly profile is my favorite one because it'll help us focus on specific text elements. So if you're reading a very text heavy website, this actually is going to help you focus in. The cognitive disability profile will highlight specific titles and buttons on the page to help you navigate to those elements. And then we have these two features here, the keyboard navigation and screen reader profile, which will optimize with the AI on the back end to make sure that it's an accessible experience from the code level. On top of that, we do have over, I believe, 70 different adjustments in the interface that will help you navigate different elements. So I can have a more readable font, I can magnify the specific text or change the alignment. I love the different contrast options, especially if it's monochrome or for someone who has a color blindness or prefers specific colors for their text and viewing experience, they can make those adjustments. And then when I mentioned earlier, liking to have the content really focused so that I can specifically focus on a website, I can actually turn the website into read mode, hide all the images, and then I'm just relying on the content itself. So these are some of the adjustments that we have here within the Access widget. And as I mentioned before, these are all going to be scanned on a daily basis and make sure that you have an accessible experience on your website. Jumping back into our slides, I think we have a good opportunity for questions now, but I do want to share before we jump into that we talked about e-commerce and some of the AI trends that are emerging. We are having another webinar October 22nd that will focus on some of the AI trends that are happening. We invite you to join us there. Both Kelley and I will be there, and it'll be a really fantastic opportunity to learn more about how you can be accessible for your brand. The first question that we have right now is, will we get a copy of the presentation and recording? So yes, absolutely. We will be sending this out to everyone, and we'll make sure that you have the content and any of the resources that were mentioned earlier on the call. Great. Kelley, are there any other questions that you want to share, anything that you want to share with the audience that might have been skipped on before?
Yeah, sure. I mean, I feel like a couple of questions that we often get over and over about people, great questions trying to figure out, like, I mean, you've said all this, but does it really apply to me or my business? And one of those is related to, like, does the size of the website matter when it comes to having web accessibility? And I will say that the short answer is no. There's no like exemption, so to speak, when it comes to accessibility. There's no company that's exempted from maintaining those WCAG standards for web accessibility. And in fact, there have been a number of notable cases brought against companies for violations of the ADA on websites that vary in sizes. I mean, we've seen the biggest of companies down to very small, you know, locally owned stores that present on the internet and don't have accessibility. And so there is no particular size website or size business that this applies to. Or it applies to everyone.
Mm-hmm. Well, a lot of times also we get the question of, well, okay, let's say I have received one of these claims in the past, or I'm going through a claim, what should I do? Or especially if you're a customer and you receive one of these claims, we do have litigation support as part of our service. So for customers who are paying for a license, they will get the accessibility statement and the monthly reports, but they will also receive other documentation that will help them with these cases. And I believe we have a couple of case studies on the website, especially about New York businesses who were able to remove the threat of litigation after working with accessiBe.
Yeah. I mean, you know, we've kind of touched on this, but I do think people are often like, hey, I've got a lot going on. Like, I don't know if this is the right time for me. Maybe if something does come up, then I can reach out and address it then. You know, and I just, you know, I have to just say, like, sometimes these aren't situations you should chance it on. You know, even if you remediate your site after you get a demand letter, you may still be susceptible to paying attorney's fees. Ultimately, you're still making that accessibility, and it's going to cost more once you get to that point. And I finally would just go back to the point that it really, this is the right thing to do. The right thing to do is always in the present. It's now. The disability community is a large community, and it's one I say that any one of us can become a member of at any point. We either age into it or we can acquire a disability. And so, you know, having the lens of like wanting more people to have the ability to access your business, I think makes a lot of business sense. But, you know, while as business owners we're juggling so many things, I would never suggest chancing it, because it's going to ultimately be more headache, more of your time to navigate that legal process, and more money.
Absolutely. And we have another question from the audience that is actually a fantastic question. Gregory asks, large companies like Google don't use widgets in their UI of their webpage. So is it really necessary for us to use a widget, or is there another way to implement accessiBe? So I'll start off by saying that accessiBe is not just a one product company. We do have a few different solutions for web accessibility. But on that same front, different businesses have different solutions for accessibility as well. And so companies like Google, Salesforce, Microsoft, those big names will have in-house accessibility teams that are completely dedicated to reviewing every element of the website and making sure that everything from A to Z, from comma to period, is going to be accessible for every single user. And they're still open to claims, but a lot of it is also about the documentation that you have and the reviews that you do and how much you're involved in the website accessibility. So Kelley, is there anything that you want to add to that?
No, I mean, I think there's certainly different ways to approach web accessibility. The main thing is to not make it so complicated that you can't achieve the goal of of having an accessible website. I, as a small business owner, I've had to choose something as someone who's not tech savvy that's easy for me that I can implement using accessiBe provides that, so that I know that it's taken care of and I can turn it over. But again, it all comes down to what those risks are of not looking at it, of not addressing it, not saying I'm big enough of a company to deal with it, or I don't have a team. There are a lot of solutions meant to help address it for any size company. And I think that eliminating the risk, knowing that it is there and it's growing, is a good business choice.
So you can always get started with the scan of that I'll put in the chat, the access scan, which is accessibe.com/access scan, and scan your website. We also do offer audits led by accessibility experts. So you can do that for your website and make sure that you receive all of the code elements and the remediations that might be necessary. But on that front, you would need to implement those changes on your own, whereas Access Widget is AI powered. We also have a new solution called Access Flow that was released in the past year. And this is mainly for developers to be able to implement accessibility at the code level from their dashboards. So we do have different solutions. We're happy to talk to you about those. Feel free to reach out after the recording is sent out. And we're very happy that you joined us today to learn more about web accessibility and what it means for your business, what it means for New York businesses. And just thank you so much, Kelley, for being part of this.
Yeah, great as always to join you. Thanks so much.
Awesome. Have a good day, everyone.